Good evening, everybody, and thank you for joining us in this first webinar organized by the Anti-Racism Committee in the Faculty of Education, York University. I am Nombuso Dlamini, and I am going to be host today. And I will start with doing the land acknowledgement as it is customary here at York University. As we are not all gathered in the same space, we recognize that this land acknowledgement might not be for the territory that you are currently on. We ask that if this is the case, you take the responsibility to acknowledge the traditional territory you are on and the current treaty holders. We recognize that many Indigenous nations have long-standing relationships with the territories upon which York University campuses are located that precede the establishment of York University. York University acknowledges its presence on the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations. The area known as Toronto has been caretaken by the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat. It is now home to many First Nation, Inuit, and Métis communities. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. This territory is subject of the Dish with One Spoon Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes. Again, I want to welcome everyone here for joining us in this webinar. I'm going to start by just giving context as to how the Committee on Anti-Black Racism evolved. And for this, I want to take a moment to thank my colleagues, especially Sarah Barat, who is on sabbatical, but spearheaded really what followed. The Committee on Anti-Black Racism in the Faculty of Education, York University, was formed in response to recent and ongoing incidents of anti-Black racism, and it was formed in June of 2020. In creating the committee, the Faculty of Education declared its commitment to specific principles to guide the faculty plans for concrete actions within our committee structures. The first principle had to do with amplifying representation of the contributions, perspectives, and lived experiences of Black Canadians and the African diaspora. The second principle was to support Black students and graduates of our program by prioritizing Black scholarship and awards under our control. And the third principle was a commitment to support the students, staff, and faculty who have long heard, faculty who have been affected by everyday racism and who are now even more burdened by it. And the fourth principle was to commit to addressing the systematic and structural discrimination that still occurs within the faculty, and to addressing the positive efforts mentioned above by following through the recommendations of the Access Working Group report. And on that day, on June 11, the Faculty of Education committed to creating an ad hoc committee to determine how these principles will guide work within our committee structure in the faculty. So the committee itself is a very large committee made up of over 28 people from the Faculty of Education, tenure track, the students, representatives, as well as secondees and staff. The committee was tasked to configure actionable items under each of these 5 principles. Now, we've been working as a committee diligently throughout the summer to actually come up with the actionable items. So today's webinar is one of those items. However, we have many items which unfortunately I cannot present them here yet because we have not been able to present them at Faculty Council as we started there. Panelists for this webinar, Black and Indigenous Alliances, Reconfiguring Education for Otherwise Futures, have been asked to create a space for inquiry and a space for engagement through radical dialogue as they consider different questions. And one of the questions is, how might we think about education as a site that cultivates conditions for structural transformation, and not just as a place for the socialization and culturalization of young people? The other question that the panelists are going to try to answer is, what historical alliances can we take up in order to enact these changes? Another one is, why and how could Black and Indigenous peoples and their alliances challenge racist practices and institutions? And how or do not these challenges differ pedagogically from the multicultural innuendos that dominate teaching and learning? So within this webinar, what we expect is that panelists are going to create a space of dialogical and listening practices that can be difficult, yet generative and necessary, as imagining otherwise futures means futures that undo white supremacy and its ontological logics. Personally, also on the Anti-Black Racism Committee, we are very excited by this moment. This is a moment that is actually exciting because it's a reflection of work that has been going for decades. It is a return actually to this work that has been done for over decades. And institutions are now actually admitting and facing the fact, and they're opening up to face the fact that how they function, actually these systems and structures of functioning are in many, many different ways racist. Racism then is a structural thing, and institutions are openly now trying to come up with dialogical spaces that are just outside of the classrooms, and that they are actually really engaging in this dialogue. More importantly for me, I've been very, very excited when I look at the movements that are going on, the fighting, the demonstrations, the struggle per se, this what Angela Davis calls the preparation for a revolution. I've been strengthened, motivated, and I've been hopeful because I see that this is more than just about anti-racism. It is also about revitalizing and centering once more the women's movement. When I see young people, young girls out there carrying, placards and saying enough is enough, I'm like, okay, so the feminist movement was started in the 60s and 70s. It's still going on. And so I really get excited in that. With that note, I am going to introduce the panelists in the order in which they are going to speak, but I'm going to introduce everybody at the same time. Our first panelist is, just forgive me here. Our first panelist is Excel Burnett, who is a doctoral candidate at in the Faculty of Education and had been formally seconded in the Faculty of Education up until last year. She is now back teaching for the Toronto District School Board. Our second panelist is Professor Warren Critchlow, who is Associate Professor also in the Faculty of Education. Susan Dion is our third panelist, She's Associate Professor, Indigenous Education in the Faculty of Education. She is also the Director of the Master of Education Urban Indigenous Cohort and the Indigenous PhD Cohort, the BED, Wabana Indigenous Teacher Education Program in the Faculty also of Education. The next panelist is Professor Carl James. He is the Senior Advisor on Equity and Representation at Broad York University, and he is also the Jean Augustine Chair in Education, Community, and Diaspora. I am Nombuso Dlamini, and I am Associate Professor also in the Faculty of Education, York University. And lastly, we have the honor of having our discussant here, Associate Professor Andrea Davis. I always do that, Andrea. She is Associate Professor in the Department of Humanities, York University, and she's also the Special Advisor of Anti-Black Racism Strategy in the Faculty of Liberal Arts and Professional Studies. And so that's the panelist. I'm going to now invite everyone to the question and answer box. If you have any questions, do send us questions, and we will actually take some of those questions during the discussion time. I also just want to let you know that this webinar is being recorded, so people will have time to view it afterwards. Plus, we do actually have live streaming through to the Faculty of Education's YouTube channel. So those who are not able to be here today, they can actually access this webinar. Okay, thank you very much. And Ixchel, I invite you to start with the presentation.
Thank you so much. Pigali Nanotoka Ixchel, greetings everyone. My name is Ixchel. I am Indigenous Nahua Zapoteca from Mexico and a guest on the lands of the Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, and the Anishinaabe peoples. I would like to thank the Faculty of Education Anti-Black Racism Committee for inviting me and organizing this webinar. I'm really honored to be here engaging in this conversation with Dr. Critchlow, Dr. Dion, and Dr. James. Just so you all know that, you've all had a great influence on my teaching and learning practices. So Tlatsokamati, thank you. So to be clear with terminology, I'm going to use the term educators that will include teachers, support staff, and administrators, and basically anyone working directly with students. As stated, I completed my secondment in July 2020, and I'm back to the board with the Toronto District School Board with TDSB in an elementary classroom. And after being away from the classroom for 5 years and coming back to school, I have noticed many positive changes, but at the same time, I have to admit, I feel that there's a bit more challenges in addressing anti-Indigenous and anti-Black racism. I will address my experience and observations on 3 main points based on the questions provided by the committee. The 3 points that I'm going to address today is, the first one is the deep uncomfortableness and fear from educators feel in addressing anti-Indigenous and anti-Black racism. The second point that I will be addressing later on is how gender-based violence against Indigenous and Black communities are taken up socially, as we've seen through worldwide activism, and what we need to think about as allies. And finally, I would like to address on current practices that are making space for structural transformation in education. Yet I do have to emphasize there's a lot of work that still needs to be done in this area. So TDSB, is leading in addressing anti-Indigenous and anti-Black racism in schools through new policies that are being implemented to better understand, address, and prevent discrimination in schools. But how these policies are being carried out are a whole different issue on its own. The examples that I'm going to provide are based on conversation with many friends and colleagues, my personal experience, and the friends that I have from various boards, friends from different boards across the GTA. So now coming to my first point, I think the first issue that we need to address is, before we get into structural transformation, is the huge discomfort and fear most educators continue to feel in just even beginning to disrupt anti-Indigenous and anti-Black racism in schools. Now, unfortunately, what I've just said is nothing new, right? There's vast amounts of research that states the fear and discomfort of educators, but it's something that it still continues. The two most common spaces in schools where educators can engage in anti-Indigenous and anti-Black racism discourses are during staff meetings and during lunchtime. And, the lunchtime professional developments, we call them lunch and learns. And of course, due to COVID-19, all other professional development is online. So, not just to clarify, the staff meetings are mandatory to attend, while the lunch and learns are optional attendance for educators. Now, in my experience with staff meetings, administrators are asking critical questions for educators to critically think about. Questions are being asked in staff meetings to engage, such as, how is racism being enacted in our school, in our curriculum, in our schools, in our books, in the way that we speak to students? And I think, these are really good questions to ask for self-reflection. And but from my experience, what I hear after those, good questions are asked is silence. A lot of people are not comfortable in speaking up. It is still mostly Indigenous and racialized folks speaking up on the matter. There's a huge discomfort in openly and honestly engaging in these important conversations because of the fear of being labeled racist or insensitive. So what spaces can boards and schools create to engage in these conversations with openness and vulnerability? Staff meetings due to collective agreements have an allotted time of no more than 75 minutes, and lunch and learns at best are 30 to 45 minutes. And we know that these allotted times are not enough to create and sustain structural transformation. So what more can boards do to support schools, and what can schools do to support educators? As we know, structural transformation requires time, time to reflect, time to engage, time to think and rethink. And though there is an attempt to create these spaces during, from what I've experienced in staff meetings and lunch and learns, and we know the urgency that we need to address, to address these issues based on decades of data on anti-racist work, this is simply just not enough time, right? So how can we reimagine spaces for transformations in schools? There are people who want to speak up and are in the journey of unpacking their own racist ideologist or internalized oppression, but some do not know how or where to begin or what language to use. It seems almost like they need that critical friend who engages with them, and this usually falls on the shoulders of Indigenous and racialized bodies. I'm beginning to think about it, and I wonder, what is the union's roles and responsibilities are in anti-Indigenous racism? And I ask this because, now some educators that are trying to engage in these conversations during staff meetings or lunch and learns are making are making mistakes, right? And when they're being corrected in a respectful manner, because this is the space that we have where we can engage in these matters, the educators being corrected feel that they're being attacked, right? Or, now, they're claiming that they're scared to voice up their thoughts because of the fear being scoffed at, or, worse, being labeled racist or insensitive. And, the educators that are being corrected are now, complaining to the union that they do not feel safe, or that they feel that they're being attacked. So, I do wonder how unions are addressing this matter and protecting marginalized educators from unintentional and sometimes intentional racist or microaggression remarks during staff meetings. While at the same time, Indigenous and Black bodies are in the staff meetings hearing these racist or microaggression remarks that are mostly unintentional, but at the end has caused harm. And I do wonder, like, whose safety matters when having these discussions. There's also a a huge discomfort and fear in some educators in even using the language of anti-oppression, like even using the words anti-Indigenous or anti-Black racism, because, you know, some believe that elementary students, you know, have these tender minds and are too young to learn these words, and it might stress them out. And, you know, there's also a fear from some teachers that what if students start calling each other racist and not taking the term seriously? So one of the roles and responsibility of educators, I think, is to realize that anti-Indigenous and anti-Black racism is not just a lesson or a unit plan to be embed or a unit plan. Like it needs to be embedded in our everyday practices. And, you know, though at the same time, you know, these educators have been aware that children begin to build their biases by the age of 3 years old, they still have a real fear and discomfort and influence students too much. So how can we create structural transformation when there's still a discomfort and fear from educators? You know, what spaces are required to engage in these conversations to create a space for transformation? You know, in my school, we have a anti-Indigenous and anti-racism committee where we're grappling with these questions, you know, where educators that are interested, you know, we meet once a week after school, and, you know, I lead sharing circles or circles of trust where, of course, with safe social distancing, where we have open, honest, and vulnerable conversation. But again, you know, it falls on the shoulders of the leadership of racialized people. Now, coming to my second point, we're currently in the middle of, you know, the 16 days of activism against gender-based violence. That is from November 25th to December 10th. And this made me think about alliances. What came up to my mind is how gender-based violence against Indigenous and Black bodies are taken up socially, as we've seen through worldwide activism. And to provide some context, a Canadian context, you know, the Assembly of First Nation states, and I quote, you know, Indigenous women and girls are five times more likely to experience violence than any other population in Canada. And this violence tends to result in more serious harm, end quote. Indigenous women and girls continue to experience violence, and though there has been awareness and marches across Canada, they have not received enough, in my opinion, you know, national attention from the media, organization, institutions, and so on compared to men. You know, this makes me wonder how the media takes up gender-based violence and which gender gets the most media coverage, worldwide attention, and when thinking about institutions, what new initiatives come forward or receive funding. Also, when thinking about gender-based violence, we need to think about its intersectionality of race, gender, and class. So I think we all have the responsibility to think about how gender-based violence is taken up socially and in our institution. And finally, I would like to address current practices that are making space for structural transformation in education. We need to keep in mind that, you know, due to COVID-19, I think we're in a critical time where we have the opportunity to reimagine school practices that can disrupt Eurocentric ideologies. You know, things in school are not business as usual. So let us, and nor should it be, right? So let us use this time to critically think with colleagues on what changes needs to happen and how we can begin implementing those changes and start creating that change. So I just want to talk about two examples where we need to rethink pedagogical approaches. The first one, for example, is Orange Shirt Day. You know, has stated in their website, the purpose of Orange Shirt Day is for communities to come together in a spirit of reconciliation and hope, because every child matters. And in this context, every child matters, you know, has to do with Indigenous children that were forcefully removed from their families and communities by the RCMP, the Canadian government, to forcefully assimilate them into Eurocentric ideologies. You know, in other words, the cultural genocide committed against First Nations, Métis, and Inuit children. So students learn about Phyllis and her experience in residential schools, but somehow the centering of Indigenous children in residential schools gets derailed, and the erasure of Indigenous voices happens. So for example, you know, students are given handouts with the sentence starter, I matter because blank. And some students' responses are, you know, I matter because I love my mom and dad, or I matter because all lives matter, or I matter because I need an iPad to learn. So and these are things that I've seen through Twitter. So the voices of Indigenous people through these activities are erased in silence. And why? Like, I wonder what understanding are educators missing when providing these types of activities to students? What is the purpose of these pedagogical approaches? Another point is Spirit Days. So, Spirit Days traditionally in schools were held for fundraising, which that is a whole other problem in itself. But, due to COVID-19, educators are trying to find ways to lift students and educators' spirits up, right? To find community. Folks, like not being able to congregate in large groups the way that schools are used to is really taking an emotional toll on all of us. So now we're engaging in conversations about what is the educational value of Spirit Days, how we need to be mindful of unintentional racist, sexist, classes, etc. Past experiences have been during Spirit Days, such as, for example, Crazy Hair Day, right? Crazy Hair Day, we know it's problematic because some choose to come to schools wearing an afro or cornrows or a native long braids. And students are learning that this type of hairstyle is crazy, which is the form of dehumanizing Indigenous Black people for the sake of making school fun again, as well as other members such as the Sikh or Muslim community that can't participate. And, and I've been hearing phrases such as, but we've always done it this way, or it's a school tradition, and those comments become problematic because we need to think about what traditional school practices need to change and address the reasons why some of these school traditions promote racism, sexism, classism, etc. I think in this case, it's best to ask students what they want, right? And take the opportunity to critically think with our students why some of these past Spirit Day events are problematic and come up with new ways. Like the best people to ask in schools are students. So, to conclude, we as educators need to be ready to be comfortable and feeling uncomfortable when addressing anti-Indigenous and anti-Black racism. Only then can we create structural transformation systems. We need to create intentional spaces and time for educators to engage in critical conversations on anti-racism practices and problematize past practices. Data is also important because behind data are stories of Indigenous, Black, and racialized peoples. There's a lot of work to be done, and the educators can no longer hide behind the excuse of I'm scared or I don't feel safe, when Indigenous and Black and racialized students' lives are depending on it. Thank you.
Thank you, Excel, for that, giving us all of that. We're going to have to think very clearly and have a broader conversation at the end. So I thank you for taking the time to prepare us and to give us really concrete examples on pedagogical approaches and problematic pedagogical approaches. I'm now going to turn over to introduce Professor Warren Krishla, who also is education. Thank you, Warren.
Okay, great. I think I'm ready here. Okay, thank you so much, Professor Delamy and the Anti-Black Racism Committee for inviting me to participate, and to all the fellow organizers and panelists for tonight's conversation. And also thanks so much, Excel, for that impassioned presentation. I'm just going to read from a prepared text and not actually try to answer any questions, but try to just think about my own pedagogical practice in the context of the questions of addressing anti-Black racism in the university, and more specifically in the Faculty of Education and in the work of teacher education and graduate studies in education. I think we need an educational practice that at its core investigates the complex relationships between settler colonialism and and anti-Blackness, a practice that aims to explore pedagogical possibilities that emerge from that kind of shared inquiry. Scholars have begun to point out that the presumptions of solidarity, antagonism, or incommensurability between Black and Indigenous communities in Canada are insufficient to understand the relationship between these groups when these relationships are predicated to such a large extent on crushing conditions of inequality, marginalization, and inequity, both inside the university and in the larger community. Structural transformation in the university and society really concerns imagining new futures beyond historic forms of settler colonialism and racialization that continue to govern the present in such an active and visible way. In my view, there are a number of questions arise from this thinking. In particular, what are the forms of relationality, multi-directional connections that a faculty of education might engage? That is, what viable points of making relations across difference that acknowledge and recognize specificities of histories of colonization, oppression, and struggle, but also consciously reach for points of commonality, shared, however different those experiences of colonial terror are, however fleeting and fraught those conversations might be, however tentative and transitional their outcomes. Those relations are offer a crucial vantage point for imagining new practices of solidarity. And one of the things that we might begin to imagine, at least pedagogically, is how to achieve such, such conversations, how to create the kind of spaces in which those conversations might take place, and how those conversations might contribute to, both the training of future generations of teachers, new kinds of scholarship, new kinds of activity within the faculty of education, and new kinds of collegial relationships within the university and the faculty of education itself. I imagine that educationists need to create space and time to develop critically essential conversations among Black and Indigenous and other scholars, students, activists, community, engaged folk, artists, writers, performers, and so on. We need to create what the scholar Lethebo King and her collaborators in their book, Other Worlds Against Settler Colonialism and Anti-Blackness, call precisely other worlds. In her earlier book, Black Shoals, Offshore Formations of Black and Native Studies, Lethebo King, for example, mobilizes the metaphor of shoal, an offshore geologic formation that is neither land nor sea, as a critical methodology or space to theorize the encounter between Native studies and Black studies. This means, I think, pedagogically, a space to bring into ongoing conversation all kinds of Black and Indigenous knowledge production, modes of thinking, critical practices of activism, spirituality, art, song, politics, aspirations for another kind of futurity, of another kind of freedom in the world beyond histories of conquest, histories of colonization, slavery, neocolonialism, gross inequity, institutional structures of white supremacy, whether those are conscious or unconscious. In my undergraduate and graduate teaching, I've been reaching for and experimenting with the idea of a multi-directional pedagogy. That is, as opposed to the older multicultural managerial approach to curriculum, where you line up difference in mutually exclusive silos and look at them each one by one as if in a tightly sealed vitrine case in an archaeological museum. Rather, multi-directional means that we try to read for the specificity of experience, while also remaining conscious of those moments of commonality and shared experience that might gesture towards a different kind of futurity that requires us to dig deep into those possibilities and to draw them out, to excavate them from the sedimented kinds of histories under which we now labor with, in a sense, such blindness and such indirection. In my courses, we try to read and think in these kinds of multicultural terms, again, recognizing specificities of history, experience, modes of representation, and so on, while reaching for points of crossover and commonality, where something in thought, in experience, in practice is shared, even if only briefly and tentatively. In these moments of pedagogical experimentation, we try to imagine, even if in speculation, and here speculation, I'm trying to think about Sadie Hartman's recent book, Wayward Lives, Beautiful Experiments. What kinds of potential histories still might arise from those examples that we find, those tentative and transitional examples of shared moments of experience that may, against the grain of the divisive forms of oppression, politics, geography, and education that keep us separate and which shut down in certain kinds of ways those conversations, disallow and unable them in the university. For example, in my graduate seminar, Biography and Education, which will run next term, we will examine several different examples of scholarship in education and biography. These will include work in curriculum theory that aims to understand the contribution of formal academic studies make to the life and to the capacity to share lives with others. The biographical situation of living in difference in increasingly interconnected and interdependent world. The lives of curriculum theorists of all kinds, writers, activists, teachers, students. We will consider other autobiographical accounts of educational experience in memoirs of otherness and outsiderness, Black, Indigenous, migrant, gendered, non-conforming in sexual identity. Methodologically, we will consider biographical research method from several sources to include existing biographical texts, photographs, video, films, other life documents, ephemera, and data students self-define towards their own individual inquiries. As we comparatively explore convergences and divergences between biographical modes of thinking, for example, in two texts that I've used in the past, the Indigenous activist in chief, Bev Sellers from BC, her memoir of residential schools and settler colonialism, titled They Called Me Number One, Secrets and Survival at an Indian Residential School, and bringing that into conversation with the late Stuart Hall's memoir of Caribbean migration and intellectual self-fashioning in the aftermaths of colonialism and post-colonialism, Familiar Stranger, Life Between Two Islands. There's much that separates those two works of memoir, but there are these very interesting points where they cross over and they're actually saying the very same thing and using the very same language. And it's those moments that we want to stop at and dwell upon as moments that might signal a certain kind of way of imagining a different kind of futurity, a different kind of making solidarity across those differences in experience. Now, we might learn from, we might ask a lot of questions here. What might we learn from reading these kinds of narratives, bringing these kinds of discrepant, what are usually considered to be discrepant narratives, things that are not brought together. They seem to be fixated in their particular kinds of silos. They're balkanized in certain forms of study or studies as we organize these these things in the university and in the curriculum. So what does it mean to think multi-directionally through these discrepant memoirist accounts as we imagine what it means to imagine biographically informed research, practice, and education that not merely cuts across difference, but imagines new forms of solidarity with difference, while refusing to reduce one experience to the self-sameness of another. For example, while keeping the dialogue going, keeping the questions open, at the same time that we recognize and work with the incommensurability of those questions and of that dialogue. That is what does this kind of what the late Edward Said called contrapunctal reading achieve? What do these kinds of discrepant engagements with biographies do to and for our considerations of educational possibility in a diverse world in which histories of settler and post-colonialism continue to haunt contemporary life? These are the questions that interest me in theory and practice, not as the old form of coalition, which usually means acts of coalescing, temporary kinds of mergers of individuals and movements and practices, in which one usually absorbs the diverse elements of the other into a whole and reduces the very idea of coalition to the least common denominator, thereby weakening the very point of coalition and the pedagogies and politics that they might seek. There is an interest here in the common, and that interest takes its point of view on the locating a certain kind of unity of action around specific issues. For example, structural change in the institution, watching each other's backs in the divisive politics of the institution, and so on, acting in solidarity in specific moments for the common good, for joint action, while recognizing specific concerns and keeping those concerns as open forms of political and pedagogical participation towards a different kind of future. Thank you so much. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Warren, for that very kind of like mind provoking talk. Yes, I'm going to be thinking about, how we are or can work within and across our geographies of identity in order to form meaningful, supportive coalitions. Thank you. Thank you very much for that. So now I am going to ask Susan Dion to give us a talk.
Thank you. It's nice to be here. And in my talk this evening, I'm going to share my reflections on alliances and how we might approach cultivating them. Neolangamati, Quinganawalomwa, Nijishinzi, Sheshkohalawas Dion, Non-GIE Nahi, Walk Toronto, Ni Dilana Pewe, Potwatome, Niha Nish Minito, Anashik. So greetings, it's really good to be here. And I wanna thank the organizing committee for this webinar and for inviting me to share my thoughts with you tonight. So in my introduction, I say non-GIE Nahi. That means I'm from downriver. And I'm sharing with you here a photo of the Delaware River. In our language, it is Lenape Hoking, or land of the Lenape. I am from downriver. Although we were forcibly removed from our territory during the mid-1700s, our teachings, ontologies, and epistemologies are rooted in life lived in relationship with the river and the land. We carry our languages, our stories, our ceremonies, and our traditions with us wherever we go. And as Brock Pedawanakwat explains, as urban Nishnabeg, our ancestral legacy is to reconnect with the landscape and live honorably and sustainably wherever we reside. I grew up in a small city in southwestern Ontario where the St. Clair River meets Lake Huron, and have spent most of my, my adult life living here on the shores of Lake Ontario in relationship with this place, the urban Indigenous community, and with the diversity of people who now call Takaranto home. So my initial response to the request, actually, it was a little bit more of a demand that I participate in this webinar, was one of anger and frustration. Why, I thought to myself, were my Black and Indigenous colleagues and I being asked to talk about racism and white supremacy? In these situations, I tend to pay attention to my emotions, knowing that strong emotions are usually an indicator of learning. So reflecting on my anger, I realized that it sometimes feels as if racialized people are being asked to solve the problem of white supremacy. While we have a lot to say about what it feels like to experience the hate and violence of racism, we cannot solve it for you. It often feels like we are being asked to tell stories of victimization, as if reproducing ourselves as pitiful victim will elicit change. I fear all it accomplishes is a reproduction of deficit thinking about Black and Indigenous people as damaged, in need of help and healing. This does more to reproduce supremacy than disrupt it. Additionally, my frustration and discomfort are in response to the kinds of discussions that I am hearing in response to the request for us Black and Indigenous people to talk about white supremacy and racism. These requests operate as a recruitment strategy, initiating conversations structured by practices of competition. In preparation for this talk, I listened to podcasts, read articles and transcripts of recent lectures, and was struck by the different ways in which the colonial practice of divide and conquer continues to play out in our conversations with each other. We cannot seem to talk about our shared experiences of racism without being drawn into arguments over how we are implicated in each other's oppression. In more recent talks, I hear participants turn away from discussions of who is the most oppressed, turning instead toward practices of applause when Indigenous people say to Black people, "Oh, you're so amazing." And Black people say to Indigenous people, "Oh, you're so amazing." So I start from the position that we have been purposely set against each other. Barriers have been erected, keeping us isolated from each other. And I find myself asking, what if, rather than framing our relationship within practices of competition imposed and maintained by theories of supremacy, we draw on Black and Indigenous epistemologies and center relationship? What if we decenter competition and focused our energies on cultivating deep alliance? So turning toward my ancestral teachings and to inform my thinking about deep alliance, I understand As Dene scholar Glenn Coulthard explains, that for Indigenous people, our work is about getting our land back, but it is not only for land in the material sense, but also deeply informed by what the land as a system of reciprocal relationships and obligations can teach us about living our lives in relation to one another and the natural world in non-dominating and non-exploitative terms. Coulthard calls this a place-based foundation of Indigenous colonial thought and practice grounded normativity, by which he means the modalities of Indigenous land-connected practices and long-standing experiential knowledge that informs and structure our ethical engagements with the world and our relationships with human and non-human others. So centering our relationship within Indigenous epistemologies provides new, old ground to cultivate alternative ways of knowing and being with each other, disrupting imposed narratives of who we are and instead writing narratives about who we can be in relationship with each other. We have the capacities to recuperate from the violence of white supremacy. But this is not easily accomplished. And I'm thinking about who we are in relationship with each other and asking, how do Indigenous and Black people come to know each other? And more importantly, how do we want to know each other? It seems to me that much of our knowing has been framed by white people. And here I find Kathy Absalon's work helpful. In her book, Kendasawin, How We Come to Know, Absalon reminds us that Anishinaabe have always been searchers and knowledge makers, that our ways of making knowledge are living, fluid, and grounded in traditions of a people who depend on searching, gathering, and sharing. So I'm inspired by the potential in Deep Alliance, and am thinking about how we might begin the work cultivating a relationship framed by something other than white supremacy, humanism, capitalism, and patriarchy. In our dialogue with each other, we have to learn to recognize and honor difference. This means listening to each other to understand rather than to compete, fix, or make better. How we come to know requires listening to each other so as to enable acting with consideration for each other. It means accepting that we have been taught to judge each other, make assumptions about each other's intentions. Deep alliance requires us to be invested in each other's well-being, knowing that my well-being is dependent on your well-being, caring for your well-being ahead of my own, and trusting that you will do the same for me. So Daniel Heath Justice explains it this way. Relationship requires commitment and enacted obligations. The question of being and becoming a good relative itself presumes active and meaningful engagement. Relatives aren't just static roles or states of being, but lived relationship. So it's not an accident that Black and Indigenous people have survived 500 years of colonial violence. We survived because our languages, our teachings, our ceremonies, our stories teach us about our responsibilities. And as both Coulthard and Heath Justice explain, an understanding of our obligations to and with each other. The concept of deep alliance that I'm thinking about is different from notions of alliances motivated by trade and commerce that I think ultimately are self-serving. We can learn how to do deep alliances through the wampum belts and treaties our ancestors made with each other. In the land acknowledgement, my colleague spoke about the dish with one spoon wampum. There was an agreement that recognized our shared commitment to take care of the land, to take care of each other, and to pay attention and to be conscious of our actions and interactions with each other. What we take from each other matters a great deal. Similarly, the 1776 covenant chain wampum reflects the concept of ongoing care. The chain that binds us in friendship will rust and break if it is not taken care of. Polishing the chain signifies the need to take care of the relationship, to give time, attention, and effort to the alliance. So I'm thinking about the specifics of alliance as a particular kind of relationship. I don't completely reject the idea of there being something in it for me. It cannot be one-sided. It has to be reciprocal. Cultivating deep alliance means doing the work, knowing it's going to be difficult. It will take time. It will require us to see things in ourselves that we do not like, and it will be a living, changing relationship. What I am calling for is participation in dialogue that interrogates belief systems that structures not only our institutions, but our understanding of ourselves, our understanding of each other, and our understanding of ourselves in relationship with each other. There are alternative ways of understanding the world and ourselves in the world, and they are accessible to us. In their book, Otherwise Worlds, Tiffany Lethabo-King, Janelle Navarro, and Andrea Smith write, by considering our human capacity to create and conjure a better world into existence, we have the potentiality to reorder the coordinates of our lives. This in no way erases the historical and present realities of genocide and slavery, but instead seeks to feel where we come from to arrive at where we want to be together. An otherwise world then feels our histories, as Diane Million has argued, in generative ways, so that our affective dispositions are part of the liberation paradigm. Our Black and Indigenous existence as resistance intervenes in these daily experiences. So listening and responding to each other's stories means creating places for doing this work in collaboration with each other, with our students, and with a consciousness of the ways our own competitive proclivities required of all of us in the academy impact our interactions. I know that there is space within the university to disrupt settler colonialism by creating Indigenous places of teaching and learning. I know it is possible because students and I have done it. But how we do it is a topic for another talk. For now, I want to finish with words from Daniel Heath Justice, who advises us. What is clear is that the stories that will make a difference are not the easy ones. If they don't challenge us, confound us, make us uncomfortable or uncertain or humble, then I'm not sure what they offer us in the long run. Because to my mind, it's the difficult stories that offer hope of something better. So rather than thinking about what it is going to take from each of us to get there, rather than thinking about what we can and cannot afford to do, I advise that we begin thinking about what it looks and feels like to be there. Anashik.
Well, Thank you. Thank you, Susan, for reminding us that there are other ways of understanding the world and ourselves within that world. That's a great reminder and great lesson. Thank you. Thank you for that. I am now going to call upon Professor James to actually take the floor.
Thank you very much. And thanks for inviting me to do this, and to the other panelists. And as all of you were talking, I kept wondering, what can I add? And thanks very much to Susan. It provided a good context for what I want to say. And I cannot avoid thinking about the context in which we're asked to do this work right now, and the context that we're having this discussion about how we might start thinking about Indigenous and Black relations and alliance in the academy. I also think very seriously and take very seriously the fact that at this time in the academy, a number of things are going on, and I wondered how we might want to think about them. So in preparing for tonight, I started thinking, what do I want to talk about? What should I be saying? And of course, as Nambuso indicated, I am the senior advisor on equity and representation at the university. And in that case, it's what is this all about? So I'm using the opportunity to engage in some ideas that I've been considering, especially with regard to Black and Indigenous scholars in the university. So I did give my presentation a title, which is Target Hiring. Is this the only way Black and Indigenous scholars can get into the academy? Not being very sure if that conveyed the idea, I reworded it to target hiring Black and Indigenous scholars. Evidence of progress or entrenched racism within universities that call upon this. And I want to do this in a number of ways. First of all, I'm going to present the context in which this discussion about equity, discussion about the presence of Black and Indigenous in the academy is happening. And then I want to go on to look at some of the advertisements that exist right now in terms of hiring of Black and Indigenous scholars. And then I end up with a number of questions I want us to consider. So we should know that this context of equity, this context of Indigenous and Black faculty, scholars, and the contributions we make, it's coming out of the employment equity context, in which in 1984, Judge Rosalie Abella chaired the commission that brought up the affirmative action, brought up employment equity. And we're told that she considered the US affirmative action, but decided not to use it because of the emotions and ill will surrounding affirmative action. Nevertheless, she came up with employment equity, and we now have the Employment Equity Act, which came into being in 1995. The purpose of this act is to achieve equality in the workplace so that no persons shall be denied employment opportunities or benefits for reasons unrelated to ability in the fulfillment of that goal, and to correct the conditions of disadvantage in employment experienced by women, Aboriginal peoples, persons with disabilities, and members of visible minority, by giving effect to the principle that employment equity means more than treating persons the same way, but also requires special measures and the accommodation of differences. And so it's this accommodation of differences that came into being, and we have to think about the context. After this came about, there were a number of awards that were established called Employment Equity Achievement Awards, and that there were a number of faculty and a number of universities got Employment Equity Awards. So such awards as Outstanding Commitment to Employment Equity Award, other awards were Innovation Award and Sector Distinction Award and Employment Equity Championship Award. all these employees who have federal contractors program would be assessed, evaluated, and looked at in terms of the extent to which they advance equity, and they got awards, including York University and a number of other universities. Nevertheless, remember we said that in the 1980s, 1985, and so forth. Nevertheless, we know that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission provided 94 recommendations or call to action, and number 7 of that recommendation reads, we call upon the federal government to develop with Aboriginal groups a joint strategy to eliminate educational and employment gaps between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal Canadians. Within this context, then, we have to say how much have these employment equity and our programs have helped Indigenous people advance in terms of education. And for us here at York, it was a year ago that the Subcommittee on Employment Equity and Inclusivity brought about or gave in its recommendation to York University. And that joint committee asked that, had a mandate to make recommendations how the university can most effectively increase the representation of Black faculty at York University. Because according to the self-identification survey, Black faculty only made up 2.3% of the faculty complement at that time. And building on the Indigenous program, one of the recommendations was that there could be a program of hiring that would be these cluster hires, as we are noticing. So York University, as the task force indicated, has several programs designed to facilitate equity, diversity, and inclusion. And these programs exist. And therefore, they were saying that we can just build on the programs. And with respect to hiring then, while on one level, we have been doing quite well in terms of hiring racialized people, we weren't doing all the way for Black and Indigenous. So there were a number of recommendations that came out of that report. It suggested, as I said, targeted hiring. It suggested review, revise, and update the affirmative action program of the university. Talked about building the pipeline, because the pipeline was critical in order to have potential Black scholars who would come into the university. And it asked for an increase of the retention rate and look upon it this way. So that this, I think, and doing some further research, we'd notice that this is not the first time that York has had some attempts to address issues related to the Black presence on the university campus. For example, in 1988, the Center for Race and Ethnic Relations opened. And according to Dr. Dryden, who worked at York University at the time, she wrote an essay that talked about the work of the committee that eventually established the center, recommended the establishment of the Center for Equity and Race Relations, because it was because of a Black PhD student, Janice Joseph, was being harassed by undergraduate male student, and that became an issue, and therefore that was one of the remedies that was suggested. But as she said, that did not go far enough. And she also noted that on March 12, 1992, at York University, students protested anti-Black racism in the university, and the protest was a response to a number of racist incidents. And she lists a number of incidents that were going on at York University. And she talked about students occupying the president's office before agreeing to leave the office because, for their demands being met. So in other words, the context then that we have here is these changes have always been been part of struggles that communities have had in order to bring about what would be responsive to their needs, interests. So now we have class hiring of Black faculty and Indigenous faculty. And this is not only happening at York University, but happening at other universities. A brief look at some of the advertisement these days will give you a sense. And I want to list a number of them. For example, the University of Toronto, OISE, has a position for the applied psychology and human development. And they ask, we seek to recruit a scholar with a strong research focus and practical expertise in Black, African, or Caribbean mental health. And the person must have some strong research background in terms of looking at the effects of anti-Black racism. And the University of Toronto also has a position in criminal law and society in the Department of Sociology, and they're asking that applicants have a letter of application describing their research agenda and contribution to equity and diversity, including experiences confronting racism in their own lives and or in their lives of others. Dalhousie University has a position in physics and atmospheric science, calling for keeping with their principles. They're going to have the position, and the position is restricted to candidates who self-identify in one or more of the following groups: Aboriginal people or racially visible persons. And that person, and the persons of African and or Indigenous background would be ones who should be asked, who are asked to apply. And there also, within the last week or two, we've been getting lots of things on emails from McMaster, hiring about 12 in 6 faculties in business, engineering, health sciences, humanities, science, and social sciences. And they're asking that people have qualifications and they must self-identify as Black African descent with lived experience. A successful candidate will be joining a vibrant and networked campus community of Black scholars, and that goes on. And for us at York, we have 14 hires in the 6 or 7 faculty, and that people must self-identify as Black peoples of African descent, and they're going to be supported, and this is by the African. They are supported as they do so. Now, what can we expect? In looking at what many of these coming Black and Indigenous faculty come into the university, I looked at what Ivan Joseph says in an article he wrote some weeks ago, in August in the Globe and Mail. He talked about, while these things happen, the difficulty is that racism finds its way into that process. And he also talked about the ways institutional racism operates. He said, and he gave 4 or 5 points that he identified, and I want to list them. One is institutional racism is white leaders within the prevailing power structure arranging a meeting before the meeting to align the majority around their position. He talked about racism as tokenism of when Black and Indigenous faculty gets hired. And he talked about how institutional racism is asserting that if someone's background doesn't fit a narrowly defined path in power, they just aren't qualified. And he goes on to say institutional racism is people questioning the quality of your ideas whenever you have an opinion they don't agree with, pursue an outcome they don't like, or proceed in a way that is unconventional or counter to the established culture. And that, he says, is some of the factors that we can expect. So my question that I started off with is, do we have to have these structured ways in which we're going to bring Indigenous and Black faculty into the university, or can we not simply open it and hires are going to come because we understand racism, we understand the biases, and therefore we now know how not to do, have a narrow view of what would be considered excellence or what would be considered demonstrably superior. But the fact is, York University has had affirmative action since the mid-1980s, and we haven't moved very far in terms of having the diversity that we should have. So we'll target hiring of Black and Indigenous faculty members, really bring about the change we need, or is it going to just simply peter out after now and things remain the same? So what's going to happen after these hires? After a year or two, will we be able to see Indigenous and Black scholars hired without being targeted? And will we see difference in the curriculum, course content, reading materials, faculty programs, and the composition of our student population, because Black and Indigenous scholars have been able to bring their entire selves into their scholarship, into their teaching, and to their service? And will they be able to get tenure and promotion? Will the presence of Indigenous and Black faculty members help to reimagine education? In the case of faculties of education like York, what role might Indigenous and Black voices, scholarship, commitment, and involvement in the community play in reimagining an education for a more equitable and inclusive Canada? Thank you. Obviously, I have lots of questions.
I can see that, Professor James. Thank you very much. I see now, after listening to you, I do see why you thought Professor Dion's talk really related to or offered background to what we're going to talk about, because she also spoke about competition. But I'm not the one to actually do the discussion and pulling all of these factors together. So now I'm going to invite Dr. Davis to actually pull all of these factors that we've been listening to, all of these points together. I'm also going to continue inviting the participants to send questions and comments up to the Q&A chat box. And we are looking at them, and we're going to have time after Professor Davis to actually have conversations and to actually address some of these questions. Okay, thank you, Andrea.
Thanks, Nyambuso, for the invitation to join the conversation this evening. I had no idea how difficult my job as discussant was going to be, having listened to those really, really rich interventions. I'm really thankful to the members of the panel, Ixchel, Susan, Warren, and Carl, for your generosity of time and ideas and the very rich conversation you've provoked. I'd like to begin by acknowledging my peculiar location in these territories. I recognize first that I am shadowed by the blurred but persistent history of Black communities that have existed in the place we now call Canada for more than 200 years before my arrival. I therefore walk in humble knowledge of those who have gone before me. As a descendant of West Africans formerly enslaved in the Americas, who were taken from their lands against their will, I acknowledge that I also live within the territories of many Indigenous peoples. I am committed to what Tiffany King, who many people have quoted tonight, calls a notion of mutual care, and what Susan Dion in her intervention tonight called a deep alliance. I recognize that a future for Black peoples is not possible without a future for Indigenous peoples who have lived in these territories for many thousands of years and by whose leave I walk, live, and share this land. I'd like to offer this response, if I may, by way of a provocation that reflects on my positionality, both in relation to the Indigenous peoples of Turtle Island and historical Black communities in Canada, and to think about what a notion of mutual care or deep alliance might look like in my relationship with these groups. As we cultivate what are really critical and necessary alliances between Black and Indigenous scholars, it's also important, and this has been sitting with me for a while, that it's important that we recognize the need not only for intergroup alliances between Black, Indigenous, and other racialized scholars, but also that we recognize the need for some difficult conversations among Black scholars. And so I want to start there tonight. As we think, for example, about increasing the representation of Black faculty in Canadian universities as a strategy for addressing anti-Black racism, which Carl, talked about all the complexities of, it's easy to forget that Blackness itself is a heterogeneous and capacious category. Black faculty in university classrooms come from diverse geographical, class, and cultural backgrounds. Some of us come out of a long history of chattel slavery in the Americas, but many of us don't. Some of us are the first in our families to go to university, and some of us come out of a well-established Black middle class. It's not surprising that the overwhelming majority of Black faculty in Canadian universities are first or second generation Caribbean or African immigrants or African Americans. The groups that go missing almost entirely are those Canadians who come from historically Black communities or who are third and fourth generation Canadians. These are the groups that have experienced racism at all levels of the educational system and over several generations. In addition to the experiences of chattel slavery and segregation experienced by historical Black communities in Canada that have led to ongoing disenfranchisement, the research that Carl and others have done shows that second and subsequent generations of immigrants fare worse educationally and economically than their first generation parents. We have to be careful then in the work of diversifying the academy and increasing the representation of Black colleagues in the academy, that we think really carefully and thoughtfully about what we think Black excellence might look like and who gets left outside the door because they have disproportionately been affected by anti-Black racism. These are overwhelmingly our graduate students and the students in our undergraduate classes. Are we really preparing them to be the next cohort of Black scholars, or are we imagining Black excellence as still always originating from somewhere else? And if excellence continues to overwhelmingly originate from somewhere else, are we really correcting the problems of systemic racism that exist in Canadian society? Or are we simply relying on the idea of symbolic representation, that if the numbers of Black and Indigenous faculty increase from 10 to 20, then by doubling the numbers, that act in and of itself means we have made some kind of substantive change in the system? So now we have 10 people with tenure and millions more who are disenfranchised. Indigenous women and girls, as Ichel points out, are still dying. I don't think that any of us can really genuinely say that we believe that constitutes real change. The assumption that Black scholars automatically, because of their skin color or ethnicity, will care about and want to champion issues of equity doesn't even hold. While all of us may stand to benefit from affirmative action programs, not all of us are necessarily prepared to do the hard work of changing the university. The hard work of changing the university, the speakers on this panel tonight have suggested, cannot actually begin at the top by increasing the number of Black and Indigenous senior administrators or faculty. It needs to begin at the bottom, as Ichel suggests, the hard work, the daily work of embedding anti-racist practices at all levels of the educational systems, in ensuring that Black and Indigenous students have greater success in the elementary and high school systems. And by going beyond that, to increase the graduation rates of Black and Indigenous university students, encouraging these students to enter more diverse educational paths in the sciences and the humanities, and not just in social work or nursing. Only when we can see those kinds of changes sustained over a long time will we really begin to address the fundamental damage to the fabric of our society. And in doing this kind of interventionist work, I go back to a point Ichel raised, that there is still deep discomfort and fear in addressing anti-Black, anti-Indigenous racisms. So how do we encourage our non-Black and non-Indigenous teachers and university colleagues to really engage in an anti-racist struggle without having Black and Indigenous people do the constant work of educating and re-educating the very people who are responsible for the oppression in the first place? Why, as Susan argues, are Black and Indigenous people always asked to do the work of fixing the harm of white supremacy, or asked to replicate that harm by enumerating the ways in which we ourselves might be implicated in each other's oppression? Rather than relationships based on competition, Susan asked, what if we cultivated relationships of deep alliance within Indigenous epistemologies of searching, gathering, and sharing? These epistemologies demand that we do some of that work, that we have to be engaged in that gathering, in that searching, in that sharing, and that it takes time and patience and diligence. And it's not just someone offering up to us possibilities for change. Targeted hires, as Carl suggests, are only really another kind of relationship based on competition that, again, Susan mentioned, often between Black and Indigenous scholars, right? Trying to compete for the small numbers of jobs in a tiny window that we're nervous at any moment will disappear. And if we're really going to reimagine education, as Carl suggests, for a more equitable and inclusive Canada, then what does that really look like beyond adding 5 or 10 or 15 new faculty members to an institution? And what does that mean in terms of really sitting together and thinking together and working together, doing the hard work together of creating those spaces? I return here to Warren's argument that new practices of solidarity between Black and Indigenous scholars, artists, and activists, as well as Black scholars across all our difference, demand alliances that are multidirectional, that recognize our differences and specificities alongside our similarities and continuities. It's in that space of uneasiness and discomfort that there's the greatest potential for productive change. This kind of deep alliance, Susan suggests further, requires that we be genuinely invested in each other's well-being, in ours, in our students, that we participate in active and meaningful engagement in which we exercise patience and care in doing the difficult work of changing belief systems and changing the world. I want to end by going back to a thought shared by Ronaldo Walcott in a webinar we were in last week together at Ryerson, in which he called the university a site of struggle, and said that to survive the institution is to be at war with the institution. And we need to be very conscious, he says, of why we're in the institution? I think this is the question at the bottom line for all of us, whether we're Black or Indigenous, whether we see ourselves as allies or co-resistors, to decide and be very conscious of why we're in the institution. If we really want to change the inequities, we need to work ultimately toward making it impossible for the university to recognize itself. So I'll stop here. Thank you so much to each of you again, and thank you to Rinaldo, who I've just quoted.
Okay, thank you so much, Andrea. This is the time now that I am going to actually invite the panelists to have a conversation with each other. We still have a little bit more time. And I am actually going to ask some of the questions that have been sent through the question and answer forum. And I would really appreciate it if we could have some conversation with each other about the topic of reimagining education, as we are a faculty of education. The first question here is about disrespect, which I'm going to take. And it says, I'll just read it. One of the biggest reminders of the disrespect towards marginalized groups and indigenous groups and groups in schools, there's a teaching of history in high schools. The question is, all of the panelists and the host, how would you address the lack of recognition of indigenous and POC history classes and textbooks? That's really the first question that I wonder if the panelists could kind of converse about. And I'm actually going to ask Susan if you can lead us in responding to that question, and then perhaps Warren does that too, and Andrea.
You did say that the person said the host as well.
I am the host, so I can go last. And I don't have to.
Well, as some folks know, this has been an area of research that I've spent a considerable time focusing my attention on and trying to understand. And I think that there are different ways that we have to respond to this challenge. And my first move is always education of the teachers, because we can provide all of the curriculum that we want, and unless the teachers are prepared to teach the content, I think that Ixchel addressed that in her talk, that they do Orange Shirt Day, as Ixchel described, but the teachers quite expertly turned Orange Shirt Day into a focus on the individual child, rather than taking up the meaning of Orange Shirt Day. So really, we have to work with educating the teachers. I think that I used to think that it was the curriculum. Teachers told me it was the curriculum, but the more research that I did, the more I learned that it is what teachers know and don't know that matters. Teachers who know will find curriculum. They will find the stories to share. It's whether or not and how they are prepared to teach the content. So I mean, that's, I think, the most important move that we have to make, but it's only one, I think, of many, and I'm interested in hearing what the other panelists think about how we address this.
Thank you, Susan. Warren, what are your thoughts on this question?
Yeah, well, James Baldwin, a long time ago, said that one of the paradoxes of education is that when you begin to develop a conscience, you find yourself at war with your society. And or you find yourself at war with the educational institution in which you are in. I think Andrea reminded me of this with her quote of Ronaldo Walcott. But once you recognize this responsibility, it's your responsibility to change not just the situation, but to change yourself so that you can change or participate in changing the situation with others. That is, if you think of yourself as an educated person. I always want to come back to the fact that we actually are in a university, and we actually are engaged in the practice of teacher education and educational studies in the context of a university. And that means that the work that we do is of an intellectual nature. I think we've long forgotten the fact that that the work of teaching and learning is an intellectual activity. And if, I think as Susan is quite right, I mean, the teachers who know something, the teachers who are thinking, the teachers who have recognized themselves as educated persons will find a way. They will find a way to liberate the constraints. There's no real lack of information and knowledge, for example. It's there, but if you're not thinking of yourself as an educated person, and you're not thinking of yourself as at least as a teacher who's an intellectual, and there was a time, at least in my lifetime, where teachers did think of themselves as intellectuals, and I don't know what's happened to that idea. I think we really have to be a bit self-critical and look at ourselves and find ourselves implicated in the very nature of the condition in which we find ourselves. 2018 was the 100th anniversary of the armistice. And that year I taught a course about the ending of World War I, and the fact that this war was actually a world's war, not just the idea that we are fed, for example, that the war was only fought in Europe by Europeans and by their colonial colleagues from Canada and New Zealand and Australia and so on, but that this was a world war, and that the colonial people from all over the world not only fought the war in Flanders Field and elsewhere in Europe, but in Africa and elsewhere, that Vietnamese colonized people were brought to the war. They maintained the machinery of the First World War, the tanks and so on. It's a fantastic story. And I said this to graduate students. They had no idea, no idea at all. And we did a project in the library, and with the librarians, we brought out all of these books and articles that have to do with, the colonial world in World War I. And people were shocked, actually. And so we really need to come back to the idea that we are actually in a university. And this really is a place of thinking and inquiry. And if we can't develop the kinds of pedagogical skills and the spaces to think, I agree totally with Susan Dion that if we continue to be driven and framed by white supremacy and so on, that's taking us down a rabbit's hole that we'll never come out of, and we'll be distracted from the actual intellectual and pedagogical work that we actually need to be doing. I think we need to bring the actual intellectual work that is supposed to take place in the university back into the practice of teaching and learning. That's what I'm committed to.
Thank you, Warren. And yeah, I was waiting to hear you talk about James Baldwin. You didn't mention him tonight. And so I'm happy that you finally did mention him, because I know I've even started rereading Baldwin because of you and your passion for his work. So I thank you for reminding us that we are teachers, we are intellectuals. And thank you, Susan, for your comments also, and reminding us that actually there is knowledge and there is a need to actually there are teachers who actually do this work. That's a very important point. There is something that Andrea said that I just want to kind of like connect with here, which is also Susan said, I think it's about the capitalist mode of production, whereby the answer, we are at a university, we are intellectuals, is a partial answer. In this lean economy, actually fighting back the institutions has got its own economic repercussions or possibilities or not just for the students, but also for everybody else. Education, we are intellectuals, but actually education has also become a means of survival in this lean economy. As a moderator, I'm going to move on to a question that I think Excel might, sorry, I mispronounced your name, might be able to lead us into thinking about it. Excellent situation of Orange Shirt Day. I said, how do we imagine student leadership and push back against spirit days which promote racist, sexist, and anti-Indigenous ideologies? That question is similar to another question that says, how can I address, sorry, I saw it down here, I'm just reading. Do you have a suggestion for how we can avoid a damaging dialogue about not doing events like Crazy Hair Day, and how other people are talking, and I quote, other people are taking away a fun event? Too often people fail to understand the damage and tend to focus on what they feel they are losing. So I would like to call you to kind of start us back about thinking with this conversation of what do we do in these instances? And the questions are very pointed towards how do you address those who lose? Your thoughts on this, Excel, and then perhaps Carl? This person didn't say the host also.
Thank you for that. I think we need to touch upon what was mentioned before of that, as educators, we need to be intellectually curious, right? And one thing that I emphasize with teachers is what is ongoing learning. And, ongoing learning is not looking at teachers pay teachers or Pinterest, right? Like ongoing learning needs to be transformational. Ongoing learning means reading a book with your students and not just reading it to them, but engaging, critically thinking, engaging with them of what does this mean? What is the purpose of Orange Shirt Day? I'm teaching a kindergarten classroom, and when we did Orange Shirt Day, my students understand of what is fair and what is not fair, right? And start with the language that they understand. What is, when we're talking about treaties, they know what is a promise, and a promise is a promise. They know what is a lie, right? So, it's very, like, at times I think, it's very simple to teach, but somehow this fear and the discomfort keeps teachers from teaching this content in a righteous way and gets derailed, and then the erasure happens and it causes more damage, right? So, to me, I think, we need to rethink of what is ongoing learning, and ongoing learning needs to be transformational. Ongoing learning starts with reflecting with the self and thinking about what is it that I know that I don't know and that I want to find out, right? So, and it's not just about, here are the lesson plans, here's the unit plan, and regurgitating information, because that's not learning, right? So I think the way that I think about it is that when all these things start coming up, and start thinking, well, what does this mean? What is the pedagogical purpose of this? How is this promoting social justice? How is this anti-Indigenous and anti, Black racism? So yeah, those are my thoughts. Thanks.
Thank you, Giselle. That's wonderful, really. Andrea, I listened at one of your talks some time ago where you spoke about how you do this in your own classroom at the university. In other words, bring up new pedagogies and all that. I don't know if you would like to share that, because it's not just the elementary classroom, it's also the high school, it's the university, where we have to think about the things that we do with our students in the classroom. Do you think you might share?
I mean, for me, in a university classroom, it's always important for me to help my students not just deeply engage the material and the text that they're reading or watching, but to be able to translate that knowledge that they're acquiring and to apply it outside of the classroom. So what does this mean in my everyday relationship? What does this mean? How does this change the way I walk and move through the world? How does it alter the way I thought before I came into this classroom? After having read Fanon, right, or James Baldwin, how does my world shift? How do I begin to see things differently? So for me, education at its core is transformational. That's really, really critical for me. So acquiring the knowledge is just one small piece. Students can do that anywhere. They can do that by themselves. They can Google and do that, right? I want to help them make another leap, right? Make another leap through that material, through those texts, through thinking together.
Thank you. Thank you, Andrea. And Carl, I don't know if you want to add anything to that before
Yeah, there's an important piece for me in the university classroom as well. And I think that we should start thinking about how do we co-construct the curriculum or co-construct the materials that we want students to engage, because also they bring an agenda that could also be used within that class. And I think sometimes it's not only come to learn from and not thinking of us helping them to think about how they bring particular knowledge, et cetera, so that they can engage fully and try out their ideas. And in trying out the ideas, they might be able to move beyond the ideas that they bring. So I really think that co-construction, and to go back to some of the discussion of the history, you know, I always think about when we think of history is, where did we start the narrative, the historical narrative of Canada? And if we continue to use the colonial start, then we're missing an important piece of that Canadian history. So we need to get back to start thinking about that as a basis for start re-educating. And probably it would mean a total revisioning or rewriting of those main history books that we constantly feed students.
Thank you, Carl. I have a, a comment here and a question, which is, I think is going to be a last question, and anyone can kind of feel free to explore this, but I'm going to start with you, Suzanne, again, mainly because I see you as first on my screen, and that's just computer. And I'm thinking right now about Christina. She's also a member of the Anti-Black Racism Committee. She's always talking about the way in which pedagogy can be a way of thinking otherwise. And so, and you, Susan, you spoke a lot about deep alliances that actually don't fit into competition, which is often how institutions survive, really. So I'm going to kind of read this question. It says, thinking about the possibility for indigenous epistemology as a way into learning towards change, I wonder if what is needed is for the dominant group, people, to undertake a critical exploration of dominant epistemologies, that we, like fish, can actually see the water we swim in, do we need a pedagogy for the oppressor? And if so, who leads? That's the question. I think it's really a beautiful question. And that talks about what you just mentioned, Susan, how we're always kind of like responding to the, to colonialism. But is there a way for pedagogy to actually apply to the education of the oppressor?
I think absolutely. And I think it really, I'm thinking about Warren's comments about, what is it that we are meant to do in the university sometimes we get so wrapped up in, in the, competition we are constantly put in with each other at every turn. We forget, we ourselves forget about our own project of learning and teaching ourselves, teaching each other in a good way, not in a I know more than you kind of way, but engaging in the conversations that we ought to be having with each other. And I think that and when we think about the violence of colonialism, we think about what was done to Indigenous people and the genocide. I think we don't think enough about the knowledge that was lost and how hard our people are working to recover that knowledge. I did a language camp a few months ago, and my ancestors were forcibly removed from the Eastern Seaboard, and we were marched north, and we traveled through Haudenosaunee territory, and we taught the Haudenosaunee our songs, just in case we didn't survive. We wanted our knowledge that was embedded in our songs to survive, even if we didn't. But we don't think enough about, what is it that, frames our understanding of each other, and how even, the concept of the normal and the human, and how are these ideas implicated in how we treat each other? And so I think we have to do more of the work that Warren was speaking of in terms of teaching ourselves and each other. And who teaches those courses? Well, I think that, like Carl was saying, we all come to this work with our own knowledge and experiences, and we need to all be engaging with each other in these conversations and thinking about, what frames our actions and our interactions with each other. I had an experience recently where I was, actually, you know what? I'm not going to share that story. I'm gonna pass. I'm watching the time and thinking somebody else needs to jump in here. But there's an interesting story here. You can ask me about it when we meet in the hallway sometime. I don't know. Maybe Warren, you might want to follow up on who teaches this course.
I'm interested in the story now that you're I was waiting with bated breath for the story and I know you're such a great storyteller and so on. We'll ask you about the story at some other point. Yeah, but I mean, I think this is all really a pedagogical question, really. I mean, we really have to come back to what really is fundamental to the work and not be distracted. I mean, we have to, the university is a site of struggle. Yes, what's new, You know, it's always been, and it always will be that way. It's always going to be set up as a zero-sum game, particularly with the the so-called others, who will always be positioned to stake out some territory as if they are dealing with real estate in a way, in the most limited kind of space, and struggle to get a little piece of the corner of the space that is allocated. But I think we need to set that, recognize that and know what the terrain is, and figure out how to go forward and do the kind of work that we try to do to bring the kinds of interesting texts and discussions into the classroom. Just the other day in the big undergraduate class, we were just reading Susan Dion, in fact, the great piece, Disrupting Molded Images. I think this is still such a fundamental essay for students, and we read that against Lynn Daniels' very interesting work of residential school photographs, the school photographs, and as she tries to reread those. And, this becomes really, the students are astounded by this. I don't know what the translation will be later, but at least they have had an encounter with something. And we hope that that will not dissipate across their teacher education, but we really have to find a way to enable teachers and teacher candidates to be able to think in this very constricted and difficult and challenging and divisive world in which we are living, and which is only going to become more divisive and more challenging going forward.
Oh, thank you so much. Any other final thoughts from you, Carl? Andrea, thank you for having done such a great discussion time. I'm looking at the time, and I wonder if you have anything that you want to add here, Andrea, Carl, and Ishel. We do have lots of questions in the question and answer box, and we can actually continue to respond to those questions. We will have a YouTube, the Faculty of Education's YouTube channel is going to be open because we're doing live streaming, and you can continue to post your observations, your comments on this webinar. We are also going to have another webinar sometime in the January term, also organized by the Committee on Anti-Black Racism in the Faculty of Education. And I do want to thank members of the Anti-Black Racism Working Group for working with me to make this possible. And there's some key players here who have done a great job. That I want to recognize Christina Delgado Vintimilla. She was very instrumental in actually creating the description. She took bits and pieces of the description and put it into a very formidable description of this webinar with the associated questions. I also want to thank Joy Manette, who worked very closely with our staff, IT staff, and all of us to actually create and mobilize knowledge about the webinar. I do want to mention actually Jason, who is our IT person, and Anderson Kawad, who also has done a great job in making sure that we've had this happening in meaningful ways. And more importantly, Bert and Grant are here supporting us today. They are people who are normally ignored because they are those sleeping machineries that make us function, but we never mention their names. I thank all of you a lot, and I thank the sub-leads. I thank all of the participants for engaging in this, and I thank all the panelists, Isel, Susan, Andrea, Carl, Warren, for taking the time to actually prepare in such eloquent ways for this webinar. Thank you very much. We'll see you next time. Watch out for this panel. Again, we will be returning exactly as we are.
Thank you so much. And to everyone who joined, thank you so much.
Yeah,
Thank
thanks.
you.
Thanks.
Thank you. Thank everyone.
Anashi Klapich-Kanawa.
I'm learning.
I want to say it the way Susan says it. That was great.
Try.
I'll need a serious in-service for that one.
But thank you. I'm going to follow up with you tomorrow in terms of just getting a sense of the everything that's happened technologically, what we can do better for the next webinar. Will that be okay with you, Bet and Grant? Okay, it disappeared.